And what they did is they identified a whole groups of chemicals that are actually carcinogenic, mutagenic, and toxic to the reproductive system. They call them CMRs. And by looking at those CMRs, they said, wait a minute, what are CMRs? What are carcinogens and mutagens doing in cosmetics and mascara and skin cream and nail polish and lipstick and all that fun stuff? And so in 2005, the European Union banned all CMRs from use in cosmetics for sale in Europe. Now, who even knew that such ingredients existed here in the United States? Nobody's told us. So certainly the U.S. government hasn't told us anything because the FDA has no responsibility to oversee the safety of ingredients in cosmetics. Now we know. The reason we know is because the Europeans have published a list. They call it the negative list. And on that negative list are all the substances that are either carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproductively toxic that are no longer permitted to be used in cosmetics in the United States. Now, by comparison, the United States FDA, which nominally has responsibility for cosmetics in the United States, has no power to assess the toxicity of ingredients in cosmetics. So you have a situation where the world's leading market, leading economic force, has basically banned these substances from cosmetics, and you have American firms, which of course operate very deeply in Europe, now faced with this challenge of what do we do now? Because we've been operating according to American rules for many, many years. Now the Europeans are demanding we take these ingredients out. And part of what I look at in the book is really what the reaction of some of the big American cosmetic companies have been to this sudden emergence of far tighter environmental health standards in Europe than they've been accustomed to back here in the United States.
So in the EU, did they actually test these individual products and say these products have this whatever in them and you can't bring them in, or did they just do a list of these are all nasty toxins that we do not want in these types of products anymore?
What they did is actually, rather than go out and test each individual product, what the European Union did is set up a committee of toxicologists who meet 4 times a year in Brussels. They gather from universities across Europe, and they assess the scientific literature. They assess the existing body of scientific literature as to the toxicity of these ingredients. And things that are determined to be either carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxins, they demand be removed from cosmetics. So they do not do testing on their own. But what's interesting about that is the literature is available. Literature is out there. There's plenty of studies out there that talk about the potential toxic qualities of various ingredients in cosmetics. But the key difference is that the Europeans are actually looking at that data and deciding, well, let's act. The Americans have access to the same data, same research institutions. This is a big global, here in Seattle, this is a very sophisticated research institution itself. You have enormously sophisticated research enterprises here in a whole array of areas, as we have all across the country. And there are very top universities here, very top scientists. And those scientists contribute to this body of knowledge around chemical toxicity. That knowledge is published in scientific journals for anybody to look at, including you or me, which is what I did for the book. And there are many citations of these journals in the book. And are part of the sort of accumulating body of evidence around these issues. So the same body of evidence looked at by European officials and American officials, very, very different response. The response here in the United States has been essentially non-existent to the data that's been accumulating over and over again. So one of the great ironies, of course, is that many of the Europeans' actions are based partly on the research of American scientists.
So what has then been the reaction of U.S. corporations to what the European Union has been doing?
Well, I'll tell you, the reaction has been very interesting. Many of the very same companies that in Europe are indicating their clear willingness to abide by the European laws. Why? Because they want to hold on to the European market. We're talking about a market of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And So I came upon many companies, both in the cosmetic realm and in the toy realm and in the electronics realm, essentially that were agreeing to accommodate to the Europeans' new requirements to remove these chemicals, and at the same time coming back here to America and saying this is impossible. How can you demand this? I saw this in the cosmetics industry. I was interviewing some very top officials in one of the largest American personal care products companies, and asking them about the Europeans' laws. I said, "What are you going to do with all these new requirements to take these substances out of your products?" And he said, "Well, no problem. We hired a couple of toxicologists. We hired a couple of new scientists. We're going to assess what we have in there that shouldn't be, and we're going to take it out and find something else." And like 2 months later, I went back to California, where I live, and watched a debate unfold in Sacramento, in the state capitol. That debate was very interesting because a group of legislators and environmental health scientists had introduced a bill that would require cosmetic companies to submit to the state the ingredient list with anything that was a carcinogen, a mutagen, or a reproductive toxin. The state health department would have to be informed, not removed from the product, but would have to be informed. And who was the main lobbyist against that proposal was the very same company who just told me in Europe that they were taking all this stuff out. And here in the United States, they were claiming that this would cause job loss and this would cause economic disruption and there would be competitive disadvantage to the United States. A whole litany of arguments that we've heard over and over and over and over again. And in this very example, you saw an emergence of this double standard that is really emerging quite vividly between what American companies say they can do in Europe, because they essentially have to do it, and what they say is impossible to do here in the United States.
And did you see repeated examples of this?
Yeah, I saw repeated examples. Let me give you another example. Toys have been in the news a lot lately. So toys have been in the news. We all know now about these sort of poisoned toys coming in with lead from China. But there's another example here, I think. Lead is, of course, technically illegal in the United States. It's just been the complete evisceration of the regulatory authorities that enabled this stuff to slip through. But let's talk about legal toxins. So when it comes to toys, we now know that the Chinese produce 80% of the world's toys. Among the ingredients in many toys in the United States are things called phthalates. Phthalates are kind of a plastic additive that makes plastic very soft and gooey and kind of fun to play with, and it's kind of like the little rubber duckies you might remember in your childhood, or maybe you play with one today. I don't know. And all the fun little giraffes and fun little toy animals that are very soft. Book covers are often use phthalates as well. Well, the evidence that's been rising around the effects of phthalates on the developing male endocrine system are quite powerful. And actually what they're suggesting is that phthalates, by exposure in the womb and exposure in the first year of life, can actually decrease the production of testosterone, which is the male sexual hormone, and not really something you want to play around with too much in the first couple of years of life. So the evidence is growing around this question. And so for the past 7 years, phthalates have been banned for all uses in toys in the European Union. Can't use phthalates. All those fun little animals and stuff like that, no phthalates permitted to be used in the European Union, basically because of this rising concern of their effect on the developing male's sexual development in a very sensitive period of life. In the United States, we have no such provisions whatsoever, with one exception, which is the state of California, where I live, finally did pass a phthalate ban, mimicking that of the European Union, which takes effect in 2009, which is essentially 10 years after the EU's ban went into effect. But here's the main point of all this, is that for 10 years, Europe's manufacturers have been prompted to develop alternatives to phthalates, far less toxic alternatives to phthalates. And there are major multinational chemical companies in Europe that have, in fact, developed alternatives that have been determined safe by European as well as American regulators. And so now we're in a situation like this, which is all those manufacturers we all know about in China, right? We all know now that 80% of the toys are made in China. Well, in those big industrial zones where they make toys without phthalates for the European Union, and they make toys with phthalates for the United States. And that is literally happening as we speak right now. And I think this is a particularly vivid example of how the United States is rapidly kind of becoming a dumping ground for products that are banned elsewhere, because even countries like Korea and Taiwan and other emerging economies are beginning to act on the phthalate question. And the interesting question is, all right, so what effect does this have? Does this send, like, European kids back to the Stone Age, so they're sitting in caves, you know, playing with, like, little Pinocchio models made out of wood? And the answer is no. If you go to any playroom, or if your friends in Europe who have kids or whatever, you'll see the same kind of fun little animals, the same goofy little doodads made out of plastic, made out of some form of pliable material. That are equally fun and nutty and nonsensical as those here in the United States. It's just that they basically do not have phthalates, which are determined to be a risk by European authorities, and we have the phthalates here in the United States. So I think, one, the notion that alternatives are there is critical, and they are there. And two, I spent a lot of time talking to industry people. I talked in every case in all these industries we're talking about. I spent a lot of time talking to representatives in those industries, including in the toy industry, which claimed, of course, that basically phthalates, if you ban phthalates in America, it'll cause job loss and it'll cause a lack of competitive position in the United States in the toy industry, and plus they're not really dangerous anyway, is the essential argument of the toy industry. So I was curious as to the actual economic effects of this ban, as I was in all the other instances I'm talking about. So I went around, I talked to all these investment analysts, both in Europe and the United States, people who have extraordinary focus on the toy industry and investment houses on both sides of the Atlantic, and not one of them could tell me that the phthalate ban had even a negligible impact on the toy industry. Toy industry financial prospects, and in fact the European toy industry has been growing at several percentage a year. So the question here is, are these changes economically feasible? When the Europeans took the chemicals out of cosmetics, what happened to the cosmetics industry? When they took them out of electronics, what happened to the electronics industry? When they took them out of toys, what happened to the toy industry? One after another, I looked into what the economic impact has been. And in fact, there has not been the sort of economic catastrophe that had long been predicted by both the European and American industry when these measures went into effect.